Imagine stepping into an opulent dining room in the 1700s and finding a delicate, frothy dairy dessert sitting untouched on the table. Now imagine checking back a week later and finding it still sitting there on the table, completely unspoiled. Looking at this mural celebrating Hannah Glasse's best-selling cookery book from 1747, you'll find the origins of this exact dish. She published a widely popular recipe that she boldly called the everlasting syllabub. Leaving raw, unpasteurized cream at room temperature for an entire week defies basic biology. By all conventional logic, that glass should turn into a curdled, sour puddle of spoiled milk within 48 hours. Which raises a rather obvious question. Was a 7-day room temperature cream dessert actually possible? Or was this the most confident marketing lie of the Georgian era? As it turns out, Glasse was telling the truth. If you mix her exact recipe and leave it on a sideboard, it genuinely survives for days without rotting, completely ignoring modern expectations of how dairy should behave. To understand how it survives, we have to look past the rustic measurements of an 18th century kitchen and uncover the brilliant accidental food science hiding inside her instructions. Looking at these antique green glass bottles, we find the reason for the dish's survival. Glasse's shopping list is exceptionally heavy on alcohol, calling for thick cream, lemon juice, sugar, white wine, and a fortified cherry. Normally, combining heavy dairy, sour citrus, and alcohol is a recipe for disaster. If a cook tried to boil those ingredients together, the heat would cause the cream to violently break into a weeping, curdled mess. But Hannah Glasse's method avoids heat entirely. The quiet genius of her instructions relies on keeping the ingredients completely cold while introducing a massive spike of acidity. When the dual acids from the lemon and the wine hit the cold cream, they gently destabilize its tightly wound protein and fat molecules. Instead of shattering, those proteins slowly unspool into long strings. As you aerate the mixture, those unspooled strings link together, forming a microscopic net that captures and locks air bubbles securely in place. All that booze doesn't ruin the dairy. It builds a tough chemical scaffold around it, forcing the cream to hold a stable, airy shape well past its biological limits. While the chemistry is sound, it remains dormant without a specific physical trigger. Simply pouring these ingredients into a bowl and walking away yields nothing but a thin, alcoholic soup. To build that airy scaffold, an 18th century servant had to take a whisk and rapidly, violently beat the liquid by hand for 30 consecutive minutes. That is an agonizing, muscle-burning toll. A half hour of continuous whipping drains the energy right out of your forearms, and early cookbooks are full of desperate inventions trying to mechanize the process just to spare the cook's wrists. If you push through the pain, you eventually hit a magical turning point right around the 20-minute mark. The loose, sloshing liquid suddenly stops behaving like a liquid and stands straight up into a thick, structured foam. Over the next few days, gravity takes over. Any excess, unwhipped liquid slowly drains down to the bottom of the glass, leaving that boozy, perfectly stabilized cloud floating beautifully on top. The ethereal texture of the dessert was entirely dependent on a grueling, invisible human effort that masked itself as an effortless treat. In a wealthy Georgian dining room, syllabub functioned as a high society performance. It was a visual demonstration of the household's capabilities, staged right at the end of the meal. Take a look at this antique glass. The entire object is deliberately engineered with a narrow base and a wide bowl, specifically to show off the distinct separation between the bright liquid at the bottom and the pale froth on top. Setting that visual perfection on your table sent a very clear message to your guests. It proved you possessed the immense wealth required to purchase imported Mediterranean lemons, heavily refined sugar, and expensive foreign wine. The syllabub glass was an edible monument, a quiet boast that you could afford to command someone else's physical exhaustion purely for your own aesthetic pleasure. If the chemistry was sound, the flavor was rich, and it genuinely survived for days on a table, why did this staple of English dining completely vanish from our kitchens? We can trace its death directly along this timeline of consumer technology. The march of 20th century convenience slowly erased the need for the dish. Mechanical refrigeration and electric mixers made it possible to whip plain cream into a fluffy dessert in 30 seconds. The arduous 30-minute acid set ritual lost its entire practical purpose. Once you eliminate the extreme manual labor, the aristocratic status signaling vanishes right along with it. A machine made the texture easily accessible, which ironically made it completely unfashionable to the elite. The everlasting syllabub demonstrates that a dish's value often comes from the labor required to create it, rather than the flavor alone. Sometimes a society cherishes a recipe because of the awe-inspiring difficulty required to bring it to the table.